The Federal Trade Commission says it has tracked more than 400,000 COVID-related scams over the course of the pandemic.
A company was incorporated in February 2020. It had no history of supplying medical equipment. It had no warehouse. It had no relevant staff. Its director had previously worked in confectionery. By April 2020, it had a £250 million government contract to supply PPE to the National Health Service. By June, the PPE it delivered was sitting in a warehouse, unusable. Gowns that did not meet safety standards, masks that failed certification, equipment bought at inflated prices that could not be used by a single NHS worker. The company kept every penny. Masks that failed certification. This is not an isolated case. This is the pattern of what the National Audit Office called the single largest procurement failure in British peacetime history. Between March 2020 and March 2021, the UK government spent approximately £8.7 billion on PPE contracts. Of that total, the NAO found that £4 billion was spent on contracts that should never have been awarded.
Early indications are that the Department for Health and Social Care spent in the region of £15 billion on PPE procurement.
Equipment worth approximately £2.6 billion was written off as unusable or unsuitable. The Public Accounts Committee found that the government's own fraud investigators identified £1.1 billion in contracts with sufficient fraud indicators to warrant investigation. And at the centre of it all was a system the government created itself. They called it the High Priority Lane. Journalists called it what it was, the VIP lane. This is the full investigation into how Britain's COVID fraud happened, who benefited, what the official inquiries found, and why, in 2026, the vast majority of that money is still gone, and the vast majority of the people who took it are still free. Chapter 1. The pandemic begins, and the procurement rules are abandoned. To understand how the VIP lane was created, you need to understand the legitimate pressure the government was under in March 2020. Hospitals were running out of protective equipment. The NHS was preparing for a surge in COVID-19 cases that no existing supply chain could meet. Global demand for PPE had spiked simultaneously across every country. The normal procurement process, advertising contracts, inviting competitive bids, assessing supplier credentials, running due diligence, takes months. The government did not have months. The Cabinet Office invoked Regulation 32(2)(c) of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015, which permits procurement without competitive tender in cases of extreme urgency. This legal provision exists and was legitimately applicable in March 2020. No reasonable person disputes that some departure from normal procurement rules was necessary in the early weeks of the pandemic. But the government did not invoke emergency procurement for a few weeks to address acute shortages and then return to normal process. It operated emergency procurement rules for the better part of a year.
£12.1 billion of PPE purchased in a single year, 2020 to 21.
Awarding billions of pounds worth of contracts across thousands of suppliers with minimal competitive process, inadequate due diligence, and in many cases without verifying that the supplier could deliver what they had offered. The scale of departure from normal process was so extensive that the National Audit Office, in its November 2020 report on the government's approach to PPE procurement, concluded that it was unable to give a full account of how decisions were made because documentation was inadequate. For contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds, there was often no contemporaneous written record of why a particular supplier was selected over another, or whether the price paid was assessed against market alternatives. Into this environment of suspended rules and documented decision-making, the VIP lane was inserted. Chapter 2. What the VIP lane actually was. Picture two lanes on a highway. In lane 1, you are a supplier who has heard the government is buying PPE. You submit your details through the official portal. Your submission joins a queue of thousands of others. It will be assessed in turn by civil servants working through an unprecedented volume of applications. You wait weeks, you may never hear back. In lane 2, you have a direct connection to a minister, a special advisor, or a senior official. You call that contact. They refer you directly to the procurement team with a ministerial recommendation or a note from a senior official. Your application bypasses the queue. It reaches the top of the pile. It receives immediate consideration and, in documented cases, direct government engagement within days of submission. The high priority lane, the VIP lane, was this second lane. It was created in response to the volume of referrals ministers and advisors were receiving from personal and professional contacts who had heard about the government's PPE buying program. Rather than telling those contacts to submit through the normal process, the government created a separate processing track for referrals from politically connected sources. The Good Law Project, a legal campaigning organisation, brought a judicial review challenging the VIP lane. In January 2022, the High Court ruled that the operation of the VIP lane was unlawful. Mr. Justice Chamberlain found that the government had breached the obligation of equal treatment in public procurement by giving higher priority to suppliers referred through the VIP lane over those who applied through normal channels without a rational basis for doing so. The ruling was unambiguous. The VIP lane was not a legitimate emergency measure. It was a preferential system that created systemic inequality in access to public contracts. The government appealed. The Court of Appeal upheld the High Court's ruling in January 2023. The VIP lane was unlawful. The contracts awarded through it did not become unlawful by virtue of the court findings alone. But the process that produced them was. Chapter 3. The companies that should not have won.
PPE MedPro company was sued by the Department of Health and Social Care, which argued that the gowns were not sterile.
The National Audit Office and subsequent parliamentary inquiries produced a documented record of contracts awarded through the VIP lane that raises questions that, in some cases, have since resulted in criminal investigation and prosecution. PestFix was a pest control company based in West Sussex. It had no history of supplying medical equipment. It received a contract worth £108 million to supply PPE, referred through the VIP lane. The company supplied gowns that failed safety tests. According to NAO analysis, a significant proportion of what PestFix supplied was unusable. Medpac Global received a contract worth £122 million for face masks. Parliamentary committees found the masks did not meet the standards specified in the contract. The masks were stored in warehouses and could not be used clinically. The government pursued Medpac for the return of advance payments. PPE MedPro received 2 contracts worth £203 million, referred through the VIP lane following contact involving Baroness Michelle Mone, a Conservative peer. The National Crime Agency launched an investigation into the contracts. Baroness Mone and her husband, Doug Barrowman, were arrested in 2023 as part of the NCA investigation. The case against them involves allegations that they received approximately £29 million in payments connected to the contracts via offshore companies, despite publicly denying any financial connection to PPE MedPro. In February 2024, Barrowman pleaded guilty to offences related to the fraud. The full criminal process was ongoing as of 2026, but the financial trail documented in parliamentary evidence, court filings, and investigative journalism had established the broad outlines of how a political connection translated into a contract, and how that contract's proceeds were distributed. Randox Laboratories, a health diagnostics company with a significant NHS testing contract that had been referred through a VIP lane-adjacent process, employed Owen Paterson as a paid consultant. Paterson was, at the time, a serving Conservative MP. He was found by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner to have egregiously breached lobbying rules by repeatedly contacting ministers and officials about Randox's government contracts while in their pay. The handling of Paterson's case, in which the government attempted to change the standards process to protect him before retreating under public pressure, became a separate political crisis in itself. Chapter 4. The Paper Trail, Political Connections and Contract Awards. The Public Accounts Committee's investigation, conducted under Dame Meg Hillier as chair, produced detailed analysis of the relationship between political connections and contract success rates. The NAO found that suppliers who went through the VIP lane had a 10 times higher success rate in winning contracts than those who applied through normal channels. 10 times! This is the statistical signature of a system that was not selecting on merit. The referral sources for VIP lane applications included serving MPs, lords, ministerial offices, special advisors, and in some cases, Conservative Party officials and donors. The government did not publish a comprehensive list of VIP lane referrals despite parliamentary requests. The Good Law Project's legal action, supported by document disclosure requirements, produced evidence of specific referral chains connecting political relationships to contract awards. One category of contracts involved companies that did not exist as PPE suppliers before the pandemic and were incorporated or pivoted specifically to pursue government contracts. Some of these companies were referred through the VIP lane by contacts who had a financial interest in the company winning, either through equity ownership, consultancy arrangements, or commission structures that are documented in subsequent court proceedings and investigative reporting by The Guardian, The Sunday Times, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. The government's position throughout parliamentary scrutiny was that the VIP lane was a legitimate triage mechanism to manage high volumes of referrals, and that all contracts awarded through it were subsequently assessed on merit. The court rulings rejected the legal basis for this position. The empirical data on success rates rejected the practical claim. Chapter 5. Unusable equipment and the cost to the NHS. The financial scandal has a human dimension that the numbers alone do not capture. The equipment procured through the failed contracts was not merely wasteful. In some cases, it actively compromised the position of NHS staff who had been promised protection that never arrived. NHS workers who spoke to journalists during the pandemic described receiving PPE that was visually indistinguishable from compliant equipment, but that failed to meet the standards their clinical roles required. Gowns that tore under normal handling. Masks whose filtration ratings had been misrepresented. Equipment that had been stored in conditions that degraded it before delivery. The NAO's April 2021 report on PPE procurement found that approximately 176 million items of PPE had been written off as unusable across the period studied at a cost of £2.6 billion. The figure represented equipment purchased, paid for and delivered, but which could not be used by a single person it was meant to protect. The storage cost for equipment held in government warehouses, pending quality assessment, ran to hundreds of millions of pounds in addition to the procurement cost. The government was paying to store PPE that had already been determined to be unusable, while simultaneously pursuing legal action against some suppliers for recovery of advance payments. A process that, for the majority of contested contracts, was still ongoing years after the original purchase. The cross-referencing of failed contracts with VIP lane origins in NAO and PAC analysis showed a higher rate of quality failures in VIP lane contracts than in non-VIP lane contracts. This is consistent with a procurement pathway that selected on political connection rather than on demonstrated supply capability. Chapter 6: The National Audit Office and what the official investigations found. The National Audit Office is the UK's independent public spending watchdog. Its reports carry legal weight, its findings are scrutinised by Parliament's Public Accounts Committee, and its conclusions are based on access to government documents that no journalist or campaigning organisation can obtain through other means. The NAO's November 2020 report on PPE procurement found that DHSC's controls for ensuring value for money were not adequately applied across a large proportion of contracts. The report documented significant variations in the prices paid for identical PPE items, with some contracts paying multiples of the market rate. It found that due diligence checks, including financial health assessments and verification of supply capabilities, were not systematically performed. The NAO's May 2021 report, specifically on the high priority lane, found that all VIP lane suppliers were subject to the same checks as other suppliers, but acknowledged that those checks were often inadequate across the programme. It found that referrers to the VIP lane were not required to declare interest in the companies they referred, meaning a referral could come from someone with a direct financial stake in the contract without any disclosure obligation. The Public Accounts Committee's subsequent investigation, published in 2021, was more pointed. It described a procurement programme that handed out billions of pounds of public money without adequate safeguards, described the government's transparency about the VIP lane as wholly inadequate, and called for full publication of all referral sources and associated contract outcomes. The government accepted some PAC recommendations and rejected others. Full transparency on referral sources was never provided voluntarily. The data that exists in the public record came primarily through freedom of information requests, court-ordered disclosure, and investigative journalism rather than through government initiative. Chapter 7: Prosecutions. The scoreboard in 2026.
Say scandalous numbers, £8.7 billion lost in total on £12.1 billion of PPE purchased in a single year.
The scale of documented fraud in the UK COVID PPE contracts is approximately £8.7 billion in the broadest measure, or the £1.1 billion specifically flagged for investigation by government fraud teams. Against that scale, the prosecution record in 2026 is a study in the difficulty of holding systemic fraud to account. The National Crime Agency opened investigations into multiple contracts following parliamentary pressure and media scrutiny. The Serious Fraud Office launched a formal criminal investigation into certain VIP lane-connected contracts in 2022. The most prominent individual criminal case involves Baroness Mohn and Doug Barrowman. Barrowman's 2024 guilty plea represented the first significant criminal conviction connected to the VIP lane itself. Sentencing and related proceedings were ongoing into 2026. Baroness Mohn denied wrongdoing. The NCA's investigation into her role was continuing. Multiple civil recovery cases were pursuing return of funds from contractors who received advance payments for PPE that was not delivered to specification. Recovery rates were partial. Court proceedings for the largest disputed sums were ongoing, with some cases complicated by the offshore corporate structures through which contract proceeds had been moved. The COVID-19 Fraud Task Force, established by the government in 2021 to coordinate investigation and recovery efforts across multiple COVID support programs, including not just PPE. but furlough fraud, bounce-back loan fraud, and related schemes, reported in 2023 that it had recovered approximately £1.1 billion across all programmes since its establishment. The total estimated COVID fraud across all programmes was approximately £7.9 billion, according to National Audit Office estimates. The recovery rate was approximately 14%. The gap between the scale of documented fraud and the prosecution rate is the story. For every pound recovered, approximately 6 have not been. For every person charged, dozens of others who participated in the procurement programme have faced no legal consequence. This is not a failure of individual investigators. It is the structural reality of prosecuting complex financial fraud at scale, across corporate entities deliberately structured to complicate attribution, across jurisdictions whose cooperation is inconsistent, across a government that was itself the procuring entity and whose institutional interest in accountability is therefore complicated. Chapter 8. The Hidden System. What COVID fraud reveals about British government. We covered what happens when government ignores a contractor warning in our Carillion video. This is what happens when the government becomes the contractor. The COVID PPE fraud is not primarily a story about external fraudsters who exploited a naive government. It is a story about a government that suspended its own accountability mechanisms, competitive procurement, due diligence, value for money assessment, conflicts of interest declaration, and then created a preferential access system that directed public money toward politically connected networks rather than toward qualified suppliers. The system did not fail accidentally. It failed in a predictable direction, upward. The money went to people with connections. The connections came from a political culture in which the boundary between party donor, government advisor, party peer, and government supplier is routinely crossed without the transparency mechanisms that might make those crossings visible and accountable. The Good Law Project's judicial review succeeded because it had evidence of how the VIP lane operated. The evidence existed because some civil servants kept records despite inadequate formal requirements to do so. The court held the government to a legal standard its own procurement process had violated. That accountability pathway, civil society litigation, judicial review, parliamentary committee scrutiny, investigative journalism, produced more documented accountability for the COVID fraud than the government's own internal mechanisms. This tells you something important about where the accountability for government procurement failures actually lives in the British system. It does not live in the departments that award the contracts. It lives in the external institutions that scrutinise them afterward. The National Audit Office, the Public Accounts Committee, the courts, the investigative journalists at The Guardian, the Sunday Times, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. The campaigning organisations like the Good Law Project. These are the institutions that produce the public record of what happened. None of them had the power to stop the contracts being awarded. They had the power only to document and to challenge what had already happened. Whether that is sufficient accountability for £8.7 billion is the question the British public is still waiting for an answer to. Chapter 9. What comes next? As of 2026, the COVID procurement fraud investigation is an ongoing story rather than a concluded one. Criminal proceedings connected to the VIP lane and associated contracts are at various stages of progress. Civil recovery efforts are continuing against multiple counterparties. The COVID-19 public inquiry, which began taking evidence in 2023, is examining government decision-making across the pandemic response, including procurement. The inquiry has access to ministerial communications, WhatsApp messages, and official documents that were not available to parliamentary committees. Its conclusions, when published, will likely provide the most comprehensive official record of how procurement decisions were made. The procurement reform agenda that emerged from the COVID experience produced the Procurement Act 2023, which came into force in 2024. The Act introduced enhanced transparency requirements for government contracts, strengthened exclusion grounds for suppliers with fraud convictions, and improved debarment mechanisms. Whether these reforms are sufficient to prevent a recurrence of the VIP lane dynamic, in which personal access to decision-makers produces preferential treatment, depends on whether they are enforced with the rigour that was absent in 2020. The structural conditions that produce the COVID fraud have not fundamentally changed. The relationship between political donors, party advisors, and government procurement networks remains a feature of British political life. The revolving door between government and the private sector continues. The culture of informal referrals and personal connections operating alongside formal procurement processes is embedded rather than addressed. What has changed is that the VIP lane is now a documented, court-adjudicated example of what that culture produces when accountability is suspended. It is in the record, it can be cited, and the politicians, officials, and business figures who participated in it will carry it in their public record for the remainder of their careers. Whether that is deterrent enough is, at this point, an open question. Closing reflection. the National Audit Office, the Public Accounts Committee, the Good Law Project, the High Court. None of them had the power to stop the money leaving. They had the power only to document where it went. That documentation exists in the public record, in the NAO reports, the PAC hearings, the court judgments, the investigative journalism, and the COVID inquiry transcripts. Everything cited in this video is publicly verifiable. Here is what I want to know from you. Do you think the Procurement Act 2023 is sufficient to prevent a recurrence of the VIP lane system? Or do you think the structural conditions, the donor-advisor-peer-contractor pipeline, are too deeply embedded in British political culture to be reformed by legislation? And the more immediate question, of the contracts documented in the NAO and PAC investigations, which do you think most urgently requires criminal accountability that has not yet been delivered? Drop the name in the comments. The cases that get public attention are the cases that investigative journalists and prosecutors feel pressure to progress. If this investigation, the government fraud, the procurement failures, the accountability gap, the money that left the public treasury and did not come back, is the content that helps you understand how power actually operates in Britain, subscribe to this channel. Every investigation we publish is sourced from official documents, parliamentary records, and court evidence. No speculation. No commentary dressed as fact. Just the documented record of what happened and why it matters.
£8.7 billion. Gone during a pandemic. And the system that took it was built by the government itself.